I'm excited to have Dr. Rosemary Radford Ruether with me. She has been a Christian feminist theologian for over 3 decades. She is one of the most widely read feminist theologians in North America. Her book, Is Sexism and God Talk, is a classic in the field of feminist theology and remains the only systematic feminist treatment of Christian symbols to date. Ruether has written and edited 44 books and hundreds of articles and reviews. She's at home in such diverse fields as patristics, the historical and theological roots of anti-Semitism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the history of women in American religion, the mythology of ancient Near East, and ecology. She is presently a professor of feminist theology at the Claremont Graduate University and Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California. Good morning, Dr. Ruether.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm glad to have you here with me this morning. My first question is, what is ecofeminism, and why has this connection been made between women and the environment?
Well, what ecofeminism basically says is that through many eras of, particularly in Christian history, there has been this way in which women have been seen as closer to the body, closer to nature, and so on. That doesn't mean that ecofeminists think that women are closer to the body and nature than men, but rather they are criticizing this kind of assumption about women's closeness to nature and to body, and they are asking about the consequences of the way in which men have distanced themselves from body and nature.
Mm-hmm. Now, why is that problematic, the connection between women and nature? How has that been destructive?
Well, basically, it is a way of subjugating both women and nature.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about this kind of ideology as both naturalizing women and feminizing nature, constructing nature as something that men can dominate and control and do with what they will, and also women. And then it also locates women sort of in the waste management and housekeeping and child caring sphere and really denies them their full humanity.
Oh, I see. And what about the idea of platonic dualism? Can you explain that for me and how that connects?
Well, Christianity, of course, originated in a Jewish context, which doesn't separate soul and body, but sees the soul as the animating interiority of the body. Mm-hmm. In its course of its development, it then connected with a more Platonic or Greek worldview, which really saw the soul as a kind of separate substance, which pre-existed the body and sort of fell into the body. And then salvation was seen as the separation of the soul from the body and its return to its true heavenly home in the heavens. And so what you have in this kind of perspective is the notion that humans really are not at home on earth.
Right.
That the earth and incarnation and the body is some kind of secondary and punitive kind of situation, and that the ideal state is for the soul to be separated and living in the heavens. Mm-hmm.
Now, how has the woman fit into that picture?
Well, in Plato, he says specifically that this is in his creation story, the Timaeus, that the gods created the souls and they put them into bodies as a kind of temporary testing place, and they should then control the matter in the body. And if they fail to do so, they will then be reincarnated in a woman or into an animal.
Goodness, yeah.
So you have here clearly the idea that women are kind of a secondary and lower state, and then the next lower state would be animals.
Oh, right. And I guess so women has been also kind of associated with matter and passion, and as I understand that the male has been associated with spirit and intellect.
Yeah, I mean obviously, it wasn't as though they didn't think men had any bodies.
Right.
But this matter, the body, and so on, is then seen as this inferior stuff that ought to be dominated and controlled by the mind.
Right.
And then men, and one should quickly say actually ruling class men, because there were also men who were, slaves and peasants and so on. So you have a class as well as a gender kind of hierarchy, and the tendency to associate those who are seen as inferior with body and matter and that which is to be dominated, and that's much more actually very explicit also in Aristotle.
Right. Okay. Well, if that classic understanding then of salvation is kind of an escape from the environmental world, which I can see contributing to destruction of the environmental world, as an ecofeminist reacting against that dualistic understanding of creation, how then would you re-envision salvation, if not in some otherworldly heaven up above, or in the future, as many Christians believe?
Well, I think that ecofeminism, and this, of course, is not foreign to aspects of Hebrew biblical thought, really see a much more integrated or dynamic connection of life, energy, what you might call soul, with bodiliness, and see redemption much more as a kind of dynamic interconnection in which we then find ways to live in harmony with one another and harmony with the earth.
Right. I think Sally McFaig talks about, I think, placing more faith in hope, that the reality of salvation may not occur, but it's in the hope that we seek salvation. Are you familiar with that?
Well, I think that hope is very essential in that one refuses to accept the present situation of war and violence and destructive relationship with the earth as the best we could do. And so hope is, of course, not just empty hope. It's a hope that we can really restore much more harmonious and more just relationships between one another and with the earth.
Right. Okay. In your article, Ecofeminism, the Challenge to Theology, you argue that immortality is to be found in the miracle and mystery of endlessly recycled matter energy, out of which we arose and into which we return. You argue that consciousness is finite, beginning with birth and ending with death. Now, in that sense, I associate the soul with consciousness. So if the consciousness has a beginning and an end, and immortality is in the endlessly recycled matter and energy, then how do you understand the soul?
Well, what I don't understand is the kind of Platonic notion that the soul is a separate substance that existed before the body and will, and its destiny is to separate from the body. But rather, I understand soul as the interiority of the body, the consciousness of the body, and each particular incarnation, so to speak, has its life, its interiority, and that interiority rises and dies with the body, but it's just as life is continually renewed, so you might say soul is continually renewed, but within and as part of a body-soul interrelationship.
Right. How would you place the individual within that? Does the individual then disappear at death then?
Well, I think that the individual is precisely, the finite dimension, that every particular incarnation is is finite.
Right.
But it's within a context of continually renewed life.
Okay. Now, how is the patriarchal otherworldly God, that omnipotent, unchanging Father who art in heaven, problematic in light of environmental destruction and the oppression of women? So
Well, I think that feminists and also ecofeminists have questioned this image of the divine or God, which is really modeled after the patriarchal ruler as some kind of warrior, judge, all-controlling power that is outside of and beyond the earth and rules over it, but doesn't connect with it. And the image that feminists, ecofeminists, and actually a lot of environmentalists think about is much more the kind of God, you might say, that St. Paul talks about in the book of Acts, when he announces to the people of Athens that I have come to announce to you the unknown God, and that is the God in whom we live and move and have our being. So that is a God that is much more in and through and around and is sustaining power of life rather than this God who is the dominating other.
Right. Well, I guess that then ties into my next question, is that as a Christian ecofeminist, in what ways have you found traditional conceptions of Christ problematic, and how would you revision Christ in light of the environmental crisis and in light of the oppression of women?
Yeah. Well, I think the problem with Christology is that it was taken into a notion of a kind of warrior God and all ruler of the universe. And then it was, of course, said that women couldn't represent Christ because they weren't males, they weren't capable of this kind of dominion. And you get that, for example, in Thomas Aquinas, that says that women can't be ordained, they can't represent leadership because they really represent only that which is to be dominated rather than that which is to rule. But I think that that kind of concept is totally foreign to the New Testament Jesus, who essentially announces that he has come to give liberation to the captive, the setting at liberty of those who are oppressed. So when you return Christology to its New Testament roots, which is actually what we should be talking about when we talk about Christ, then you have a very different understanding of Christ as the one who is criticizing systems of domination and imagining a kind of transformation in which those who are oppressed are liberated and a new community of justice arises.
Right. Well, what about the claim that Christ is the unique and only revelation of God? How would you react to that?
I think it's basically religious arrogance. That is to say, Christ is a revelation of God in our tradition, very precious and very important. But why would one want to use that to deny that other people also have experiences of the divine?
And how would you relate that kind of understanding of Christ as the unique and only revelation how has that contributed to an environmentally destructive ethic?
Well, the notion that Christ is the only revelation of God really relates to a certain kind of imperialism. In other words, that we are the privileged, we Christians who have the only revelation of God, then have the unique understanding of truth, and everybody else is idolatrous and misguided, and we therefore have a right to kind of conquer and destroy everybody else's culture and make the world over into our own image.
And what about the understanding of an imminent God? I know, like, theologians like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin talk about an imminent God who is in and of everything and is kind of drawing everything towards this future kind of Christogenesis. How would you react to that, the idea of an imminent God?
Well, but obviously what I was just talking about, the God in whom we live and move and have our being, is immanent.
Yes.
But it's not immanent in the sense of simply being reduced to what is.
Right.
But it is a kind of sustaining life power, which also calls us to resist those systems of destruction and injustice in which we are immersed. So I think that the problem is the way in which immanence has been transformed from or alienated from the notion of transformation, and then transformation has been seen as something that is located up in the sky, rather than really seeing immanence and transcendence as a kind of dynamic process of both sustaining life and also transforming it from systems of injustice.
Now, in terms of evolution, would you see evolution as contributing to this, the evolutionary foundation of the natural system? Would you say that is a form of transformation? That, because Chardin argues that we're moving from a state of disorganized plurality and matter towards states of unity and spirit, and it's informed by that metaphysics of progress. Do you agree with that? Do you think that in evolution we are seeing an improvement of humanity and the natural world?
Well, I think one of the problems is to put this in a kind of framework of going from something that's bad and chaotic and so on to something that is increasingly better. And Teilhard actually, what's interesting about him is that he sees life and soul even within the simplest atom of matter. So he really embeds soul within the entire life system, rather than seeing that only as arising with humans. And I think I think that notion of continual creativity and transformation is a good idea. The danger in Teilhard's view is that he tends to associate that primarily with Western development.
Right. How would you integrate the presence of the suffering? Because evolution almost seems predicated on mechanisms which seem wasteful or careless of individual life. The predation, for example, that in order for one creature to survive, another has to die. How would you address that issue of suffering, or draw that into an understanding of a redemptive, transforming God?
Well, I don't think that one should have a kind of a simple, cheerful view of predation and suffering, or see that all of that is just fine because it leads to something better. But I think we should be engaged in mourning and the sorrow about the kind of cost of destructiveness, and one should seek ways of trying to reduce that.
Right. All right. Well, thank you for joining us this morning, Dr. Ruether. Is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude?
Well, again, I think it's important not to reduce ecofeminism to some kind of notion that women are like nature, but to have this much more complex understanding of how we have constructed women and nature in certain ways that allowed for domination.
Right. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Okay. Nice to talk to you.
You too. It's been a pleasure.